True crime meets royal luxury in what has undeniably become the darkest, most radioactive scandal ever to engulf the modern British monarchy. We are looking at a story involving a disgraced royal, a convicted pedophile, and the multi-million-pound secrets the palace prayed would remain buried forever. For decades, the House of Windsor has weathered abdications, divorces, and tabloid frenzies, but nothing could have prepared the establishment for the morning of February 19th, 2026. Picture the scene. It is Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's 66th birthday, and he awakens not to the deferential bowing of servants, but to the arrival of unmarked Thames Valley police cars at his heavily downgraded residence of Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate. This was not a polite inquiry over tea. This was an arrest on suspicion of misconduct in public office, a moment that brutally shattered the grand illusion of royal untouchability. One can only imagine the sheer suffocating humiliation coursing through the veins of a man who spent his entire life believing his bloodline elevated him above the laws of mortal men. Stripped of his princely titles by his own brother just months prior, Andrew was shoved into the back of a vehicle and taken to Aylsham police station, where he sat under harsh fluorescent lights for an agonizing 11-hour interrogation, completely cut off from the deferential bubble that had shielded him since birth. To understand the gravity of this unprecedented arrest, we must look at the damning contents of the 3 million pages of United States Justice Department files released in January of this year, which finally exposed the true depth of the Epstein connection. Andrew is not merely being investigated for his deeply unsavory social choices. He is suspected of weaponizing his former role as a British trade envoy to actively funnel confidential state information to Jeffrey Epstein. The documents suggest a staggering betrayal of the British taxpayer, detailing how, in 2010, Andrew routinely forwarded highly sensitive government visit reports from Vietnam, Singapore, and Hong Kong directly to the disgraced financier, sometimes within minutes of receiving them. It paints a deeply cynical picture of a man utterly intoxicated by his own unearned power, willing to lease out his royal aura and diplomatic access to impress a billionaire predator. The inner monologue of a man caught in such a blatant documentary trap must be one of profound panic, as the realization dawns that his arrogant assumption of lifelong impunity has collided fatally with the digital footprint of his own hubris. Behind the iron gates of Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere on the day of the arrest was nothing short of apocalyptic, a masterclass in frantic, chilling damage control. A well-placed source revealed that the corridors were gripped by a suffocating tension as courtiers scrambled to insulate the newly streamlined monarchy from the toxic fallout of Andrew's arrest. King Charles, demonstrating a ruthlessness that many doubted he possessed, issued a statement so stunningly cold it practically lowered the temperature of the room, declaring simply, "Let me state clearly, the law must take its course." It is a fascinating study in modern crisis management, and frankly, when one observes this level of genuine constitutional peril, the endless self-pitying transatlantic whining from Prince Harry and Meghan Markle about perceived familial slights looks utterly pathetic by comparison. While the Sussexes monetize their petty grievances, the king is dealing with a brother who is facing the very real prospect of criminal prosecution and a maximum sentence of life imprisonment, a scenario that threatens to irreparably tarnish the crown's remaining dignity. The long-term consequences of this arrest extend far beyond the personal ruin of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. It has permanently dismantled the mystical barrier that once separated the royal family from the common criminal justice system. By treating a senior royal, a man who still inexplicably remains eighth in line to the throne, as a standard suspect, the British police have set a dangerous and irreversible precedent regarding royal immunity. The public is now watching with a cynical, unforgiving eye, demanding absolute transparency and accountability, refusing to accept the traditional palace strategy of hiding behind protocol and polite silence. For Andrew, the psychological toll must be absolute devastation and isolating paranoia, as he realizes that the golden cage has finally, irrevocably, slammed shut. There is no longer a doting mother to write a multi-million-pound check to make the problem disappear, and there is no royal protection officer who can shield him from the cold, hard gavel of the law. To understand the sheer magnitude of the disaster currently unfolding, we must look back to the origins of this unholy trinity: Andrew, Jeffrey Epstein, and Ghislaine Maxwell, a triad born in the high society fever of the late 1990s. It was Maxwell, of course, the polished daughter of the disgraced media tycoon Robert Maxwell, who acted as the primary social linchpin, artfully grooming Andrew by offering him something the British establishment traditionally rations: unbridled sycophantic flattery and access to a world where money was never an obstacle. A source within the inner circle reminds us that in those early years, the prince was essentially a man adrift, a spare whose military glory was fading and whose relevance within the palace was shrinking as the younger generation took center stage. In Maxwell and Epstein, he found a duo who didn't just respect his title, they worshipped it, viewing his royal aura as the ultimate currency to be traded in the dark markets of global influence. The atmosphere of those early meetings was one of intoxicating exclusivity, held in the hushed five-story townhouses of Manhattan or the sprawling estates of the English countryside, where the rules of the common man simply did not apply. For Andrew, the inner monologue was likely one of profound relief and arrogance. He had finally found people who recognized his true worth, a tragic delusion that would eventually lead to his systematic undoing. The most damning revelation to emerge from the recent 2026 data dumps is the cynical way in which Andrew's official role as a UK Special Representative for International Trade and Investment was effectively leased out to Epstein's network. We now know from a well-placed source that emails dating back to 2010 involve a mutual liaison, David Stern, openly discussing how to leverage Andrew's aura and access to build a private investment office with Epstein. It is a nauseating prospect. A British prince, funded by the public, using his diplomatic weight to help a convicted sex offender navigate the corridors of power in Abu Dhabi and the UAE. One can almost feel the grease on the palms of everyone involved. When Andrew sent those emails, sometimes using the rather pathetic pseudonym The Invisible Man, he wasn't just being naive, he was being calculating. He saw himself as a grand global player, a royal dealmaker who could bypass the stuffy oversight of the Foreign Office by aligning himself with Epstein's dark capital. The long-term consequence of this specific betrayal is a deep structural rot in the public's trust. If a prince can be bought for the price of a private jet flight and a few days in a New York mansion, then the very foundations of royal service are revealed to be nothing more than a high-end brokerage. Perhaps nothing illustrates the prince's breathtaking lack of judgment and his belief in his own immunity more than the infamous 2006 masked ball at Windsor Castle for Princess Beatrice's 18th birthday. Despite there being an active U.S. arrest warrant for Epstein at the time for the sexual assault of a minor, Andrew saw fit to host both Epstein and Maxwell as honored guests within the very heart of the British monarchy. A well-meaning staff member who was present that evening recalls the eerie, oppressive atmosphere of that event, where the darkness of the guests' reputations seemed to linger just beneath the surface of the royal luxury. Andrew's inner monologue that night was undoubtedly one of smug defiance. He was a prince, and his friends were, by extension, untouchable. To invite a predator into his daughter's birthday celebration shows a man so insulated by privilege that he had lost all sense of basic human morality. This wasn't a mistake of association. It was a deliberate, arrogant signal to the world that he could do as he pleased, a sentiment that would eventually haunt his mother's final years as she was forced to deal with the inevitable explosion of this radioactive association. Even after Epstein's first conviction in 2008, when the financier was officially labeled a sex offender, Andrew's loyalty remained unshaken, leading to the truly surreal spectacle of their 2010 stroll through Central Park. To the rest of the world, Epstein was a pariah, but to Andrew, he was a convenient friend who provided a plush New York base and a sense of opportunity. According to a longtime family acquaintance, Andrew's private justifications at the time were rooted in a twisted sense of honor. the absurd idea that he was too loyal a friend to abandon Epstein in his hour of need. In reality, it was the behavior of a man who had become entirely dependent on the illicit world Epstein had built for him. The pressure within the palace at this point was reaching a boiling point, yet Andrew remained oblivious, convinced that his status as the Queen's favorite son would provide a permanent shield. The consequence of that 2010 meeting was the final nail in the coffin of his public reputation, providing the photographic evidence that would later make his denials in the Newsnight interview look not just unbelievable, but pathologically dishonest. The hidden world of the late 90s and early 2000s, as revealed in the Invisible Man emails, shows a prince who was constantly searching for fun and new inappropriate friends, often while staying at Balmoral during the summer months. There is something particularly sordid about the contrast between the wholesome, traditional image of the royal family at their Scottish retreat and Andrew's back-channel communications with Maxwell, seeking out social circles that were anything but traditional. A source behind closed doors suggests that Andrew's behavior during these years was a constant source of quiet dread for palace officials, who watched as he drifted further and further away from the expected standards of his station. The atmosphere was one of a slow-motion train wreck. Everyone could see the danger, but Andrew's stubborn refusal to listen to counsel ensured that the impact, when it finally came, would be total. He wasn't just playing with fire. He was dousing the entire House of Windsor in petrol, seemingly convinced that the fire would never dare to touch him. Ultimately, the toxic court of Epstein and Maxwell provided Andrew with a mirror that only reflected what he wanted to see: a powerful, influential, and charismatic leader. In truth, he was merely a useful idiot, a royal pawn used to provide a veneer of legitimacy to a global criminal enterprise. The long-term consequence for the monarchy has been the forced realization that the divine right of kings has been replaced by the very human reality of accountability. As we move further into this investigation, it becomes clear that Andrew's presence in Epstein's life was the ultimate trophy, a prize that Epstein exploited to the fullest. The prince's inner monologue throughout this period was likely a toxic mix of ego and entitlement, never once pausing to consider the victims of his useful friend. Now, in 2026, as the full extent of the emails and the trade envoy leaks come to light, that arrogance has been replaced by the cold, hard reality of a police interrogation room, a destination that was, in hindsight, entirely inevitable. We cannot discuss the current police investigation without revisiting that spectacular high-definition act of self-immolation, the 2019 BBC Newsnight interview. It remains a masterclass in how a combination of royal entitlement and profound delusion can lead a man to believe he can outsmart a seasoned journalist and a global audience. Andrew entered that room at Buckingham Palace, his own turf, mind you, convinced that his honorable explanation for a friendship with a convicted pedophile would somehow satisfy the public's moral appetite. A source behind closed doors remembers the Duke's buoyant, almost giddy mood after the cameras stopped rolling. He genuinely believed he had knocked it out of the park. One can only marvel at the inner monologue of a man so disconnected from reality that he thought a bizarre alibi involving a Woking Pizza Express and a medical inability to sweat would serve as a credible legal defense. The atmosphere in that gilded room must have been thick with the stench of unearned confidence, even as Emily Maitlis systematically dismantled his reputation with the cool precision of a surgeon. The immediate consequence of that interview was not the closure Andrew craved, but the total detonation of his public life. He was stripped of his charities, his military affiliations, and eventually his very Royal Highness style, a slow-motion stripping of rank that left him a prince in name only. But while the palace was busy scrubbing his name from the letterheads, a far more serious storm was brewing across the Atlantic in the form of Virginia Giuffre's civil lawsuit. By 2022, the pressure had become so unbearable that the Duke was forced into a humiliating, multi-million-pound out-of-court settlement to avoid a public trial. A well-meaning staff member has since suggested that the settlement was never about innocence or guilt in the eyes of the palace. It was a desperate, expensive attempt to buy silence during the late Queen's Platinum Jubilee. It is a cynical reality of the world we inhabit, that a man of his stature could simply pay to make a victim's testimony disappear, at least for a time. And frankly, when one considers the gravity of these accusations, the constant public hand-wringing from the Sussexes about archaic royal protocols feels like little more than a petulant distraction from the Crown's genuine existential crises. However, the narrative took a truly tragic and irrevocable turn in April 2025 with the news that Virginia Giuffre had died by suicide at her home in Australia. The atmosphere surrounding the Epstein saga shifted instantly from a legal battle to a moral reckoning. Her passing, at just 41 years old, cast a long, somber shadow over the monarchy, leaving the British public to grapple with the human cost of the years-long litigation and the relentless character assassination she endured. Her posthumous memoir, Nobody's Girl, published in October 2025, has become a definitive, haunting indictment that no amount of royal PR can erase. In it, she details the crushing psychological pressure of facing off against a global institution and describes a prince who believed his birthright gave him access to whatever and whomever he desired. The inner monologue for Andrew upon hearing of her death must have been one of cold, calculating relief, a witness silenced. But that relief was short-lived, as her death only served to galvanize the very investigators now knocking on his door in 2026. The long-term consequences of this specific chapter are now manifesting in the current police probe into misconduct in public office. The settlement, once thought to be a final resolution, has instead become a blueprint for his downfall, as the newly unsealed Epstein files of early 2026 suggest that the money used for that payment may have its own dark, questionable origins. By settling, Andrew didn't buy peace. He bought a stay of execution that has finally expired. The public sentiment has soured into a permanent icy disdain, fueled by the realization that while the common man struggles, the spare was living in a bubble of luxury funded by his family to keep the law at bay. Every time he is photographed now, the memory of that Newsnight smirk and the tragic end of his primary accuser haunt the frame. The lesson here is as old as the monarchy itself. You can hide behind the palace walls for a season, but the ghost of the truth eventually finds a way over the battlements. The tragedy of Virginia Giuffre has stripped away any remaining shred of public sympathy for the Duke of York. The atmosphere has turned from one of scandalous intrigue to one of genuine righteous fury. People are no longer interested in hearing about honorable friendships or medical conditions. They want to know how a man in such a position of trust was allowed to operate in the shadows for so long. For Andrew, the psychological walls must be closing in as he realizes that his accuser's voice is actually louder now than it was when she was alive. The posthumous memoir has provided a roadmap for the current criminal investigation, turning his own words and previous legal maneuvers against him. It is a grim, final reckoning that proves no matter how much you pay for silence, the moral debt eventually comes due with interest. The truly scandalous heart of this saga, however, isn't just the company the prince kept, but the staggering sums of money moving through the shadows to protect him. Early 2026 brought with it an explosive leak that finally pulled back the curtain on the infamous £12 million settlement paid to Virginia Giuffre, a sum we were led to believe was a private matter, but which we now know was essentially a high-stakes family loan that has never been repaid. According to a well-placed source, the breakdown of this emergency fund is nothing short of breathtaking. A £7 million contribution from Queen Elizabeth's private purse, £3 million clawed from the estate of the late Prince Philip, and a further £1.5 million donated by King Charles himself in a desperate bid to preserve the monarchy's dignity during the Platinum Jubilee. Imagine the atmosphere in those private apartments, the heavy, oppressive silence of a mother and son confronting a disaster of this magnitude, knowing that the family's hard-earned wealth was being siphoned off to silence an accuser. For the Queen, her inner monologue in those final years must have been a tragic battleground of duty versus maternal instinct, an agonizing realization that her favorite son had become the single greatest threat to her life's work. This financial bailout was never intended to see the light of day, yet a source within the inner circle suggests that the tension over the unpaid debt is what finally broke the relationship between Charles and Andrew. The king, ever mindful of the public's growing resentment toward royal excess, has reportedly been seething over Andrew's refusal to acknowledge the financial black hole he created. While the Duke of York continued to live in the 30-room splendor of Royal Lodge, he was effectively a royal squatter, living on borrowed millions that belonged to the crown's private reserves. One can only imagine the arrogance of Andrew's inner monologue during this period, convinced that because it was family money, the debt was merely a suggestion, a birthright to be spent on making his personal nightmares vanish. The surrounding atmosphere at the palace shifted from one of protective silence to one of quiet administrative fury, as accountants and courtiers began to realize that the Duke had no intention of ever balancing the books. The long-term consequences of this revelation are devastating for the monarchy's standing with the British public. At a time when the nation has faced unprecedented economic hardship, the news that millions of pounds, regardless of whether they were from the sovereign grant or private estates, were used as a get-out-of-jail-free card is a bitter pill for the taxpayer to swallow. It reinforces the cynical view that there is one law for the elite and another for the rest of us, a sentiment that King Charles is now desperately trying to counteract with his slimmed-down vision of the firm. The irony, of course, is that while Harry and Meghan were busy complaining about being cut off financially from their Montecito mansion, Andrew was quietly absorbing a fortune just to keep a deposition from happening. This financial entanglement has created a permanent stain of corruption that no amount of ceremonial pageantry can wash away, leaving the public to wonder what other loans are currently being hidden behind the palace walls. Furthermore, the 2026 police investigation into misconduct in public office has taken a keen interest in the origins of the rest of the money, the millions Andrew supposedly raised himself to cover the remainder of the settlement and his spiraling legal fees. A well-meaning staff member has hinted that investigators are looking into a series of highly irregular consultancy fees paid to the Duke by international business interests during his time as a trade envoy. The inner monologue for Andrew right now must be one of sheer terror as the financial walls close in, realizing that the very favors he traded for cash are now the primary evidence against him. The atmosphere of his birthday arrest was not just about the past, it was about the present reality of a man who treated the British state as his personal ATM. He thought he was playing a sophisticated game of global finance, but in reality, he was leaving a trail of breadcrumbs that has led the authorities straight to his door. The human cost of this financial cover-up is also coming to light, as a long-time family acquaintance notes that the strain of the Andrew problem likely accelerated the decline of the late Queen's health. She spent her final months not in peaceful reflection, but in the middle of a sordid, multi-million-pound negotiation to save a son who showed no remorse for the position he put her in. The surrounding pressure of the 2022 settlement was a weight she should never have had to carry, yet Andrew's entitlement allowed him to accept her millions without a second thought. This sense of betrayal is what drives the current coldness from King Charles. He isn't just protecting the institution, he is avenging the peace of mind his mother was denied in her twilight years. The consequence is a king who is no longer willing to play the role of the indulgent older brother, leaving Andrew to face the financial and legal music alone. Ultimately, the Epstein connection has evolved from a social scandal into a full-blown financial catastrophe for the House of Windsor. The realization that the palace effectively bought a victim's silence with money intended for the crown's legacy has shattered the moral high ground the monarchy relies upon. The atmosphere has turned from one of scandal to one of systematic failure, and the public is rightly demanding to know who else knew about these payments and why they were allowed to happen. For Andrew, the invisible man has finally become all too visible, and the millions that once bought him a temporary reprieve are now the very thing ensuring his permanent downfall. As the investigation continues to follow the money, the true price of his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein is being tallied, and it is a debt that neither the Duke nor the monarchy can ever truly repay. The spectacle of the Duke's final involuntary departure from Royal Lodge in the winter of 2026 was a moment of Shakespearean tragedy, if one can stomach casting Andrew in such a role. For years he had clung to the 30-room mansion like a limpet, convinced that a 75-year lease signed in a different era was a divine guarantee of his status. But King Charles, perhaps tired of the stench of scandal clinging to the family's real estate portfolio, finally dropped the hammer. The atmosphere on moving day was reported by a source within the inner circle as funereal, though without the dignity. Andrew was forced to trade the grand vistas of Windsor for the cramped, drafty confines of Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, the very house where Prince Philip spent his final quiet years, now repurposed as a gilded cage for a disgraced younger brother. One can only imagine the seething, impotent rage of Andrew's inner monologue as he watched movers pack away the relics of a life he no longer owns, realizing that his brother the king had finally stopped asking and started commanding. The humiliation, however, was not merely administrative, it was visceral. In a display of what can only be described as high-level psychological warfare, the Duke arrived at his new, modest residence to find that his welcome consisted of literal piles of manure dumped strategically near the entrance of the property. While officially attributed to routine estate maintenance during the spring planting season, a source behind closed doors suggests the timing was far too precise to be accidental. It was a pungent, earthy reminder that he is no longer the master of all he surveys, but a tenant on sufferance, living on the charity of a sibling who can barely look him in the eye. The pressure of this transition must be suffocating for a man whose ego was built on the foundation of grand halls and private security. He is now living in a shoebox by his standards, with his every movement monitored by a skeleton staff who report directly to the privy purse. This relocation marks the end of Andrew's attempt to maintain a rival court at Windsor. For years, he used Royal Lodge as a base to entertain the few inappropriate friends he had left, maintaining a delusion of relevance that infuriated the Prince of Wales. According to a longtime family acquaintance, Prince William has been the primary architect of this cold storage policy, viewing his uncle not just as a PR disaster, but as a genuine threat to the future of the monarchy. The atmosphere between the two households has been ice-cold for years, and the eviction was the final decisive blow. Andrew's inner monologue is likely haunted by the realization that while he is being tucked away in the Norfolk mists, the rest of the family is moving on, ruthlessly erasing his footprint from the royal landscape. He is becoming a ghost while he is still very much alive, a consequence of his own refusal to go quietly into the night. The geographic demotion to Wood Farm also carries a heavy symbolic weight. It is a house of exile. By placing him there, the king has signaled that Andrew is to be treated as a private citizen who happens to have a very famous last name, rather than a working member of the firm. There are no more royal protection officers flanking his morning rides. There is no more state-funded travel. A well-meaning staff member has noted that the Duke spends most of his days in a state of brooding isolation, occasionally seen wandering the Sandringham grounds with a look of profound bewilderment, as if still waiting for a reprieve that will never come. The long-term consequence of this move is the total isolation of the Duke of York. By removing him from the proximity of power in Windsor, Charles has effectively cauterized the wound, ensuring that the radioactive fallout of the Epstein investigation stays far away from the center of government. Interestingly, this firm handling of the Andrew problem stands in stark contrast to the way the palace handles the ongoing drama surrounding the Sussexes. While Harry and Meghan continue their lucrative career of professional victimhood from the safety of California, Andrew is experiencing the cold reality of what being cut off actually looks like. There are no multi-million-dollar Netflix deals waiting for the Duke of York, only the prospect of more police interviews and the slow, agonizing rot of his remaining reputation. The surrounding atmosphere in the UK is one of grim satisfaction. The public, weary of royal entitlement, sees the eviction as a long overdue act of justice. For Andrew, the psychological toll of moving from a palace to a farmhouse, from a prince to a pariah, must be absolute, a crushing reminder that even the highest blood can be brought low by the lowest of associations. Ultimately, the eviction from Royal Lodge was the final act in the stripping of Andrew's dignity. He is now a man with a past he cannot escape, and a future that holds nothing but the walls of a small house in Norfolk. The consequence of his arrogance has been a total loss of agency. He no longer decides where he lives, who he sees, or how his story ends. As he sits in the quiet of Wood Farm, the smell of manure still lingering in the damp air, the inner monologue must finally be shifting from "how do I win" to "how did I lose everything?" The invisible man has been tucked away in the shadows, and for King Charles and Prince William, the silence from Norfolk is the most beautiful sound in the world. This brings us to the agonizing internal machinery of the modern palace, a machine that has, quite frankly, been forced to become a guillotine to ensure its own survival. We are witnessing what a well-placed source has described as a full-scale firefight behind the scenes, a conflict not just of law, but of generation and philosophy. While King Charles reportedly dithered for months, paralyzed by a tragic paternalistic desire to protect his younger brother's feelings, it was Prince William who ultimately seized the controls. The Prince of Wales, it seems, has no appetite for the sentimental indulgences of the past. His inner monologue is one of cold, hard calculation. He understands with chilling clarity that if the monarchy continues to bleed for Andrew, there may be no throne left for him to inherit. This generational rift has created a stifling clinical atmosphere within the royal household where the spare is no longer viewed as a brother or an uncle, but as a malignant tumor that must be excised before the rot sets in. It is a truly remarkable contrast when one looks at the broader family landscape. While the world is forced to endure the relentless self-indulgent narratives of Harry and Meghan, who seem to believe that a disagreement over a bridesmaid's dress is a crisis of state, the King and the Prince of Wales are dealing with a genuine radioactive constitutional emergency. One can't help but find it slightly amusing, in a dark sort of way, that while the Sussexes complain about their security being pulled, Andrew is currently living under what a source behind closed doors describes as a form of palace-mandated house arrest at Wood Farm. He is a man who requires a chaperone to leave the grounds and has been banned from his beloved horseback riding to prevent any untoward public sightings. When you compare the two situations, the Sussexes' grievances look like a minor squabble in a sandbox, while the House of Windsor is engaged in a brutal necessary act of fratricide to maintain its very legitimacy. The psychological pressure on King Charles during this period is immense. He is a man who values tradition and family, yet he finds himself presiding over the most humiliating royal downfall in centuries. A source within the inner circle tells of a king who refuses to visit his brother, refusing even to take his calls, a silence that speaks louder than any official decree. Charles's inner monologue must be a heavy, sorrowful recognition that the era of royal exceptionalism is dead. He is appearing at fashion shows and state banquets with a smile, while just 100 miles away, his brother is being cautioned by plainclothes police. The atmosphere is one of a slimmed-down monarchy, not by choice but by necessity, a bicycling monarchy transition that has been accelerated by the sheer weight of Andrew's misconduct. The consequences of this firm stand by Charles and William are already reshaping the future of the firm. By inviting the police to carry out their investigation without the traditional palace shield, the king has effectively signaled that the monarchy is no longer a sanctuary for those who abuse their public office. This is a radical departure from the secrecy of the previous century. The long-term consequence is a crown that is more transparent, perhaps, but also more vulnerable. The public no longer sees a unified front, but a family divided by moral lines. For Andrew, the consequence is a total and absolute isolation. He is the invisible man, not by choice, but because the two men who hold his fate in their hands have decided that he no longer exists in their vision of Great Britain. Furthermore, we must consider the calculation mentioned by those close to the Prince of Wales. William is reportedly pushing for even further measures, including the complete removal of any remaining peerages and the formal stripping of the Duke of York title from the roll of the peerage. The atmosphere is one of a controlled demolition. Every action, from the eviction to the public statements of deep concern, is a brick being removed from Andrew's life to ensure the structure of the monarchy doesn't collapse with him. It is a ruthless, necessary, and deeply cynical operation, conducted by a nephew who's decided that his uncle's legacy is a price he is more than willing to pay for his own future stability. Ultimately, the burden on the crown in 2026 is the burden of proof that the monarchy can hold its own to the same standards as the people it serves. The surrounding pressure from a public that is flabbergasted by the lenient treatment of the past has forced Charles and William into a corner. As they navigate this crisis, the inner monologue of the institution itself has shifted from preserve the family to preserve the throne at any cost. It is a grim, cold reality for Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, who finds that in the modern world of King Charles III, blood may be thicker than water, but it is nowhere near as important as the survival of the firm. The endgame is finally upon us, and it is being played out not in the drawing rooms of Windsor, but on the floor of the House of Commons. As we sit here in 2026, the final reckoning for Andrew Mountbatten Windsor has moved beyond the control of his family and into the hands of the state. There is a palpable electric tension in Westminster as the removal of titles bill gains unprecedented cross-party support, a legislative sledgehammer designed to do what the king, perhaps out of a lingering, tragic sense of fraternal loyalty, could not bring himself to finalize. A well-placed source within the corridors of power suggests that the momentum is now unstoppable. The public's patience has not just worn thin, it has snapped. The inner monologue for Andrew, as he watches these televised debates from his Norfolk exile, must be one of absolute, suffocating entrapment. He is witnessing the systematic legal erasure of his identity, realizing that the very parliament that once bowed to his status is now the architect of his permanent anonymity. The atmosphere across the country has shifted from one of mere scandalized gossip to a cold, hard demand for a total severance. We are looking at the very real prospect of a judge-led public inquiry, a second Newsnight, but with the power of subpoena, where every dark corner of the Epstein friendship and those suspicious trade envoy bank transfers will be dragged into the unforgiving light of day. A source behind closed doors at the Home Office hints that the files currently being prepared are nuclear, containing testimonies from former staff who felt silenced for decades. For Andrew, the psychological pressure of this looming inquiry must be like living in a diving bell with a slow leak. The depth of the water is increasing, and the air of royal protection has finally run out. He is no longer fighting for his reputation that was buried years ago. He's now fighting to stay out of a prison cell, a consequence that seemed impossible just a decade ago, but now feels like a mathematical certainty. The long-term consequences for the line of succession are equally seismic. By formally stripping Andrew of his place as eighth in line to the throne, Parliament is effectively rewriting the DNA of the British Constitution to protect it from a moral contagion. It is a necessary, albeit brutal, surgery. And while we watch this grim historical correction, one cannot help but notice the deafening silence from the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. It appears even they have realized that their brand of manufactured drama has no place in a story this dark and this real. When the stakes are the survival of a 1,000-year-old institution and the prosecution of a prince, the petty squabbles over California security and podcast deals feel like the irrelevant background noise they truly are. The House of Windsor is currently undergoing a purification by fire, and the spare in Norfolk is the primary sacrifice. The final image of this saga is not one of grand palaces or military medals, but of a man alone in a farmhouse, haunted by the ghosts of his own choices and the tragic end of those he displaced. The monarchy will survive, but it will be forever changed, scarred by the realization that its greatest threat came not from republicanism or revolution, but from within its own bloodline. The atmosphere of the upcoming months will be one of somber transition, as the King and the Prince of Wales move to close this chapter forever. For Andrew, the inner monologue has likely reached its final bitter conclusion. He played a high-stakes game with a predator, and in the end, he was the one who was consumed. The invisible man has finally been found, and the world has decided it does not like what it sees. It is a sobering thought to end on, but perhaps a necessary one. We are witnessing the death of the old guard and the birth of a monarchy that understands it must earn its place every single day, without the shield of unearned immunity. The story of the Duke of York serves as a permanent cautionary monument to the price of arrogance and the inevitability of the truth. Leave your thoughts below. I read every word you write, and if you value this unvarnished look at the monarchy, do ensure you are subscribed and share this with those who appreciate the truth. As we sit here today, on this 6th of March, 2026, the finality of this saga has settled over the Norfolk marshes like a thick, impenetrable fog. While the headlines focus on the legal machinery, a source within the inner circle tells a much more pathetic story of the man now known simply as Andrew Windsor Mountbatten, sequestered away in the modest confines of Marsh Farm. The inner monologue of the former prince is reportedly not one of remorse or quiet reflection, but of a staggering, almost pathological sense of unfairness. He remains convinced even now that he is an anointed being, a victim of a modern world that has cruelly forgotten the ancient divine rights of his station. There is a chilling delusion at play here. He views the king's cold shouldering and the public's revulsion not as a consequence of his own actions, but as a betrayal by a family that should have protected its own at any cost. This is the ultimate tragedy of the spare, a man who lived so long in a gilded bubble that he has lost the ability to breathe the air of the real world, finding the atmosphere of his new, untitled life to be thin, cold, and entirely beneath him. The atmosphere surrounding his daily life at Sandringham is one of a slow, purposeful erasure. According to a well-meaning staff member, the Duke, or rather, the man who was Duke, spends his mornings staring out at the gray horizon, clutching the remnants of a life that has been systematically dismantled by the very institution he thought he personified. The surrounding pressure is no longer coming from the tabloids, but from the silence. The phones have stopped ringing, the invitations have vanished, and even the useful friends of the Epstein era have long since retreated into the shadows of their own scandals. It is a form of social and historical excommunication. This isolation is the most profound long-term consequence of the Epstein connection. Andrew has become a living cautionary tale, a ghost haunting the edges of a monarchy that is moving on without him. The Crown has realized that to survive the 21st century, it must be willing to sacrifice its own blood to appease the gods of accountability, and Andrew is the first and most necessary offering. This final chapter marks the end of an era of royal impunity. We are witnessing the definitive transition of the House of Windsor from a family of protected elites to a streamlined, scrutinized state institution. The consequence of Andrew's fall is a king and a future king who are now bound by a zero-tolerance policy that will define the monarchy for generations to come. As the police investigation draws to its inevitable conclusion and the parliamentary bills move toward royal assent, the man in the Norfolk farmhouse remains a figure of profound self-inflicted ruin. He is the prince who forgot that a title is a loan from the people, not a gift from God. And as the sun sets on his 66th year, he is left with nothing but the echoes of a life wasted in the pursuit of the wrong kind of power, and the bitter knowledge that in the history books of the future, he will be remembered not for his service, but for the company he kept. The gravity of this situation cannot be overstated. It is a moral and constitutional earthquake that has fundamentally altered the British landscape. We have watched a prince of the realm be reduced to a common suspect, not because of a grand conspiracy, but because of the simple, devastating power of the truth. It is a reminder that even the most ancient of institutions must answer to the conscience of the people. Leave your thoughts below. I read every word you write, And if you value this unvarnished look at the monarchy, do ensure you are subscribed and share this with those who appreciate the truth.